You are listening to Something Rather Than Nothing. Creator and host, Ken Vellante. Editor and producer, Peter Bauer.
Hey everybody, this is Ken Vellante with the Something Rather Than Nothing podcast, and I'm very excited to have Calvin John Smiley, author of The Fund. And Calvin, I'm just going to read the standard bio on your book, but to give people a little sense of what you've done. Calvin is an associate professor of sociology at Hunter College, City University of New York, the author of Purgatory Citizenship, and a co-editor of Prisoner Reentry in the 21st Century, and a guest on Something Rather Than Nothing. Great to have the opportunity to talk to you, Calvin.
Hi, Ken. Thank you so much for having me here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a bit more about defund and some other things. And I'll just add to that bio that I also am the founder and director of an organization called Till Everything Better, which we do restorative justice work with system-impacted youth here in New York.
Thank you for your work, and I really love the title. Your book has a quote right off the top from Mumia Abu-Jamal, a political prisoner of the United States. And I just wanted to tell you, why I asked you on. I've been very interested in prison systems. As a matter of fact, I've done some research quite some time ago about prison labor. I'm a union activist, labor activist in my day job. And so I was familiar with just some of the basic territory of exploitation in that particular inquiry around, wages, incarceration. I've read The Fund, and it's such a helpful way for me to learn about the kind of the radical proposition I see at the forefront of, if I could try to describe, and I'll ask a question, the idea of a radical way of looking at how we define crime, how we work with people, whether our intent is for rehabilitation, in the context that seems to me within capitalism of a strong desire to capture massive disproportionate amount of brown and black citizens, and how these systems are deeply tied to incarceration and questions of liberty in the United States. And as you go through the fund, in the background, there's a larger a question about our general approach. So I wanted to ask you, what is such a large topic, abolition or defund, but can you describe how the movement or that framework, what its conception of justice is, and how that compares to what we're in right now?
Yeah, so it's a huge question. And I think just to give a little bit more context and backstory to that point, and why I wrote the book, was that I saw something that I thought was pivotally different than what had been happening, at least kind of on a national or even like an international scope leading up to 2020. I mean, not to take anything away from the organizers, advocates, and grassroots movements that were happening, but when we look prior to that, the kind of national stage was very much calling for what could be said as reforms to the police. right? Bias
Yeah.
training, diversity of who's being hired, body worn cameras. And that became kind of the overarching narrative. Now, that's not to say that there weren't abolitionists and more leftist people speaking to more radical changes. That was always there. But the kind of mainstream arc was, how do we make the police better? How do we make them more efficient? How do we make sure they're not killing people in this way? And then what we saw is that police continued to kill people on camera. And, you know, I hate to always say it like this, whether it was the kind of perfect recipe of the murder of George Floyd, where you had four officers who ranged in their careers, right? Some were, I think Chauvin was in his 17th year, on the younger end, someone who was in their second year. They had all
Mm,
done the bias training. They had all had body worn cameras. Um, this was supposed to be the diversity wet dream, right?
yeah.
Two white, an Asian, a black
Yeah.
man, and what happened? They still killed George Floyd.
Yeah.
And so that, along with the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others, we saw this kind of shift, and that radical flank that had been there
Yeah.
moved to from the margin to the center. And we started hearing people use terms like defund. We heard abolition. That was, again, at one point only seen as this kind of radical utopian pipe dream, as something that people were now wanting to say, how do we make that a reality? And so, to bring it to your question, right, this idea of like, what does the defund movement give us in terms of a new framework for social justice?
Yeah.
I think, the answer can kind of boil down to what happened this past Tuesday in New York City, that Zoran Mondani
Mm-hmm.
won the Democratic primary. Now that's
Yeah.
not, I think, one of the biggest hits that mainstream conservative Democrats and Republicans alike have hit him on was that during the 2020 uprisings, he was tweeting out defund the police, right?
Yeah.
And one of the biggest critiques that I've received was for writing this book was that defund is over. Defund, it came, it went,
Yeah.
it was a
Yeah.
flash in the
Right.
pan.
Right.
But anyone who studies social movements knows that social movements take time. They take a lot of time. But what we are now seeing is someone who moved their way from, I'm talking about Mandani here,
Yeah. Yeah. Go. Yeah.
moved his position from someone who was an organizer and doing all this work, and now he is in a position to become the mayor of one of the largest cities in the world.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where we can kind of see. So let me sum all that up with, I don't think we have Zoran Mandani if we did not have defund.
Yeah. Yeah. I uh yeah, thank you. I was stunned. I have friends in New York City, and just kind of get on social media. I'm like, the what? I wasn't following closely, and the exuberance of some of my friends who were supporters, and maybe some of the genuine surprise,
Yeah.
all around. Um, uh, I really appreciate. I really appreciate your answer. One of the pieces here, and kind of like a little bit of the form in maybe how we talk. One of the cool pieces about your book, The Fund, and it comes out of a tradition in Haymarket Books, the great publisher, published your work, the framework of dialogues. And I'm a trained philosopher, traditionally trained in a certain sense. But in doing the show, always love uh, dialogue. Can you kind of just and I loved it. So many of the interviews in the book. Can you just speak to, as a form of inquiry, what you think something that this brings, even as classical it is that the dialogue um, brings to a discussion like this?
Yeah. So I I did it in this frame for a number of reasons, and I'll go through them. One, to your point, I really do love the tradition of Haymarket books. I believe, We Still Here by Mark Lamont Hill, Angela Davis's From Ferguson to Palestine also do it in this kind of stylistic manner. And I really loved when I read those books because, as I was telling people, I'm writing a book that reads like a podcast. That's what I was trying to like. That's how I was trying to frame it, right? That I
I
was
must have
hoping,
immediately needed to contact you. I'm like, he's already in the format.
right? But this idea that watching ideas through an exchange, I think really can help people, particularly people who are not necessarily well versed in some of the more nitty gritty or academic um, terminology, right?
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
wanted to write a book that one was accessible and readable, and I hope that I kind of struck those um, to allow for folks to read. And so, as I said at the top, I do a lot of work with young folks in New York, and so part of in my mind was, could I write a book that young folks who are system impacted would they want to pick up and read? And if they did pick it up and read, are there things that they would be able to want to pull from this, want to discuss more, want to hear more about? And so I look at the book kind of as kind of a broader platform, as a jumping off point. I know throughout the book, both myself and a lot of the folks I talk to name drop scholars, named up historical figures, name drop organizations that they're either directly a part of, who they've been inspired by, who they wish to work with. And so I think about the ways in which I came to a lot of this work. When I was reading as a teenager and, hearing, the Black Panthers talk about this guy Che Guevara. So I go read about Che Guevara. I hear Che Guevara talking about this guy Patrice Lumumba, and then I read,
Yeah.
so I look at the book as, hopefully this is a book that if someone picks it up, who might be
Like that.
new to abolition, new or wanting to hear a different way that defund is framed, that they can then go on to other readings. And so that's one part. The other part is that, coming from an abolitionist tradition, we know that abolition is a dialogue and not a monologue. It's really hard to
Yeah.
make change in silos, and so I didn't want to write a book that was just going to be somewhat of an echo chamber for myself. I wanted it to be in conversation, because part of being in conversation means that you're willing and open. You're willing and open to hearing other people's positions on the subject matter in real time. And so in real time, you're having to respond to them and kind of think about what they're saying, why they're saying it, and how they come to that position. And one of the things that I really love about the book is that, I have people in the book who are doing the work in a multitude of ways, but might not necessarily be household names to people in even leftist circles. One of the things that people have asked me since I wrote the book was, why didn't I interview Angela Davis? And my initial response is, I'm so flattered that you think I have access to Angela Davis in that way, right?
Thank you.
Right. But on a more serious note, is we know what Angela Davis's positions are, and they're
Yeah.
and they're wonderful positions, and we
Yeah.
and we build from her positions. And I think, and Angela, Professor Davis, Dr. Davis writes amazing work. But I also wanted to give a platform for organizers and system impacted folks who are also doing this work, who sometimes, because they don't have that credential behind their name, sometimes can even be overlooked even within leftist circles. And I think that it's really important to have folks doing that work.
I really like I thought a whole bunch about the way you're putting that, but one of the pieces that I like in the format is it's almost sometimes to be referenced to particular political situations that are of the time, and it captures in the conversation some of the like almost reportage of like what a situation is or what the reference point that somebody makes. And like for me as a reader, um Michael and Debbie Davis um chapter in connection to the move bombing in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
I just like as a topic, I ended up in at the time out in Cambridge, Mass, Revolution Books,
Mm-hmm.
and just came into contact with the whole world, right? Never heard anything about Move. The only way I would have heard about it if somebody laid down a track, if Public Enemy laid down a track or something, because the reportage for me and when I grew up was the freaking cassette tape. But what was Public Enemy telling me? What was somebody else telling me? I never heard of it. But then connecting in just being an alternative bookstore, a radical bookstore, reading about Move and being like, holy fucking shit, they bombed them? Like,
Yeah.
just a shock. So for me, even like reading, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm hearing their voices in their hope, in their tiredness,
Mm-hmm.
in the struggle. It was a beautiful thing for me just to come in contact, say, with those voices. Um, and some incredible discussions that you had. Um, One of the big questions I had, um, because I've come in contact with your area inquiry, and I'm a labor guy, and whenever I encounter a social issue, I tend to ask, does the labor movement, as a whole, I know it's a complicated question, but like, what role does it have? I'll give you an example. Um, Missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two Spirit. Um, the kind of disproportionate disappearance murder rate for Native folks. And those things there's high danger points around labor camps, or what are called man camps for labor around pipelines or other construction, um, that that create this really dangerous place. And thinking about that, I was like, I'm an activist within the labor movement. It means different things to different people, but what role, like, is there a larger organizational voice to speak to this? And I wanted to ask you about that. Like, for example, on the outside, labor movement, well, they're going to be representing a bunch of the people who are gainfully employed in the public sector, and unions and prison guards. There's a structure that exists. Nobody wants to lose jobs. But on the other end of it, as a movement, people are still being snatched up,
Mm-hmm.
incarcerated, bodies used, money basically pulled out of their families, pull out of them. Like, and I say, you know, what is there a role for the labor movement? And I'm not asking for a dispositive answer, but that's the way I think about it. I'm like, hey, labor, what's going on? Um, any comments on that?
Yeah, I have a bunch actually, but I just want to ask: do you want me to respond to the stuff about Move, or at
Oh,
first just about?
I would love to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then I'll come to so I'll do both. I'll
Thank
talk
you.
about Move, and then
Thank
I'll
you.
go into the labor stuff. So,
Yes.
I think for me, and I think your reaction is the way that anyone's reaction is that holy fucking shit when you learn about the city of Philadelphia dropping a bomb, a literal
Yeah.
bomb,
Yeah.
onto a residential home in May of 1985 of Philadelphia residents, and then allowed the fire to burn
To
several,
burn.
right, several city blocks. I mean, for me, I came to know what MOVE was from reading about Mumia. And at the time, I was in school in Pennsylvania, and I remember there's been two um, things that I've read about that I had to kind of say, I need to go look this up. First is,
Yeah.
if you've ever read the autobiography of Asada Shakur and her experiences being in prison in New Jersey and being locked in a men's facility and all of this. And then the second was the MOVE, the 1978 standoff that incarcerated Mike and Debbie Davis along with 7 of their family members, but also the bombing. And I remember looking this up, and this must have been 05, 06, somewhere in that realm. And I remember YouTube was still fairly new. And I remember YouTube had the video, or somebody had it, because I remember watching, because there's a video. You see the helicopter going above, and something falling out of the helicopter or being dropped out. And then seconds later, you see the explosion. And so for me, we see this, and we see this over and over again in American history, this kind of horrific form of violence, whether that is being done to Mumia and members of MOVE in Philadelphia, whether it's happening to Native and Indigenous folks, both in the United States and in Canada. Sometimes we let Canada off the hook a bit, but when it comes to their Native Indigenous populations, it is a horror show. But you have, Leonard Peltier, who spent damn near 50 years in prison and just was released at in January of this year of 2025. And then, you can look at a lot of the histories of infiltration, disruption, and all-out violence that the FBI did, that the CIA does in terms of coups and all the way back to slavery and things like that. And so for me, it was really important to have that voice, and really, it was very serendipitous that I was able to have Mike and Debbie Davis in the book. They had given a talk in Brooklyn, and I was able to attend, and it was at a really cool space over here in Bushwick called Mayday Space. And after the event, I was able to go up and introduce myself and told them the work that I had done. They were willing to share their email with me, told them that I was interested in interviewing them for this book project. And so we met on Zoom, and one of the things that intrigued them to say yes to this was how I was really interested in who Mike and Debbie Davis were before MOVE, and who Mike and Debbie Davis are today. Obviously, spending 40 years in prison is a large part of their story. But as I had said to them, and as they knew, a lot of people have told that story. They can tell that story, right? And they're the only ones who can tell it best. But the fact that I was so interested in learning who they are today, and the name of that chapter, Justice, Healing, Healing, Justice, comes from something that they had said at that talk in Brooklyn. And it was something that was really, really cathartic for them. That's kind of how they phrased it for me, because, as they say, and as it's written in the book, they did not wake up that day in August of 1978 and say, hey, I'm going to leave my community for the next 40 years. People don't wake up to be martyrs. It happens. And so there's the different images that they have. There's the public image that people like you and I look towards for strength and resilience in these moments of hopelessness or helplessness. But then there's the reality of their being human and losing that time with their family and losing family members and not having those different milestones and abilities to celebrate. As they talked, their youngest son, Mike Jr., was born in a Philadelphia jail. And it took 40 years for him to hug his mother and father outside of a prison wall. I mean,
Wow.
that's a really hard thing for anyone
Yeah.
to go through. And so I really felt it was really important for me to have their voice in this book, because when you think about what had happened in those 40 years, right? They had been locked up kind of at the one of the high points of kind of the black radical um, uh, era of the second half of the 20th century, and they were being released in 2018 into this Black Lives Matter era, right, where people were once again
Yeah.
having
Yeah.
a racial reckoning around policing, prisons. What does it mean to have a statue of Frank Rizzo, the mayor
Ugh.
of Philadelphia, who was a racist piece of shit, right? And so to me, that was really important. And we've just seen in the last couple of years, the city of Philadelphia has recognized the wrongs, but how do you repay that? And they haven't repaid that. I mean, I think that's the other big thing, is that there has been no real reparations given to members of MOVE, descendants of the members of
Yes.
MOVE who've lost their life. And so I think it's really important to keep that that story alive and not let it be buried in the history books, because if we don't want it to be repeated again, then people need to know about what MOVE is and what happened to MOVE, and that the city of Philadelphia, the state of Pennsylvania, and the country of the United States is still on the hook to repay them for what they went through.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. I
yeah.
completely
So
agree.
so I really appreciate having them in the books, particularly, and still having a relationship with them. It's really been a highlight for me. Um, to to go to the question about where does the labor movement in this?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the labor movement has a huge role in how do we resist police, prisons, hyper criminalized surveillance. And so, a couple of things that, this makes me think of is that, one, police unions are not legitimate unions. I mean,
Right. Right. It's
I
a
sit
weird
on that.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
I
a
mean,
weird thing.
it's a very weird thing, right? Police writ large are here to protect capital. Um, and we see it displayed at anytime there is a protest, anytime that there is um, a glimmer of people organizing, the police are out there in full militarized regalia, right? I mean, I always think of the image of um, the CVS in West Baltimore after Freddie Gray was murdered by the Baltimore police, and you
Yeah.
had a CVS that was literally surrounded, barricaded by full police in riot gear, and so it highlights. And there's other images here in New York City
Yeah.
in 2020. The same kind of image of police surrounding the statue of Columbus in Columbus Circle. It just shows and highlights that
Yeah.
capital is protected over people, and that police are disseminated and sent out to make sure that capital is always protected over people. There have been numerous cases just here in New York of people who were harassed in summer of 2020, and we have it on video. Right? I mean, like, these are not hearsay. We see the objective video of a person holding a piece of cardboard and getting body slammed to the ground, and the cops' script is always, they resisted arrest, or we thought that they had something,
They
or
were a
I was
threat.
injured,
Something
right?
was
And
in
those,
their hand. Yeah.
yeah, and it's always this kind of thing. So just off the rip, I want to say police unions are not labor; they are something different. They
Yep.
are there to protect capital, yes, and protect their own jobs. But I think when we think about how labor can help disrupt all of these things, one is thinking about how there can be, people who are architects and in construction and plumbing and electricians and all of these types of labor who will take an active stance and say, we will not build new prisons, right?
Yeah.
I think that is a huge form of resistance, right? That you, as the builders of this country, or the builders of a civilization, can actively take a role by saying, no, we will not participate in creating these types of death and destruction institutions. That's one thing. I
Yeah.
think with, going back to what I said when we opened with the um, uh, Democratic Party electing Zoran Mondani as the candidate for mayor, we can see a synergy here where there are now labor unions who are endorsing him or coming around to endorsing him. And what is he calling for? He's calling for affordability. So I think labor has a huge role
Yeah.
in creating cities and creating societies that can be more affordable. And that is where, in my mind, labor unions have the most strength, is in their numbers, is that labor unions can literally make or break the capital, right? So if things are going to get made,
Yeah.
that's due to labor, or they're not going to get made, or we're going to put a halt on what we're creating. And I think that is all really important. I think if we think about it through a kind of collective stance, and we see more people in labor who have a excuse me, a stake in ownership, we can see prices coming down, right? Right now, real estate is so high because we're paying landlords, we're paying these, faceless, nameless kind of shell company over shell company of property management that, that's what's driving the prices. So if we can have more people in labor owning, I think that's really important. I think we can also think, as you mentioned, people are afraid of losing their jobs, and I think that's a serious concern, right? I don't think anyone is downplaying that, but I think we should also be thinking about alternative type of jobs. Before he was completely co-opted, Van Jones, I can't stand the guy now, but he wrote a book called The Green Collar Economy, which I thought was a pretty interesting and novel way of thinking about how do we look towards alternative energies. And there is a swath of people, right, formerly incarcerated or system impacted folks, other people who are underemployed or unemployed, people who are in dangerous jobs like in coal mining and other areas, who, if we invested the energy, time, resources, and funding into alternative energies, we could create lots and lots of jobs. And so I think that is something that we can think about. Like, what are alternative jobs that people can get into? And then the last thing I'll say, and maybe this is even controversial, even amongst labor, but we need to think about universal basic incomes, right? Like, I love the idea of labor and us working, but I'm also like, maybe we all don't need to work all the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Maybe we should put less of an emphasis on work in some areas and more of an emphasis on leisure and creativity. And if we created a society or a system that gave people all of those basic things, housing, healthcare, opportunities in education, then we would be able to use our time in the way that we see fit. If we want to, be creative, if we want to just binge Netflix, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? I think oftentimes we get boggled down into this idea that, we need to be working all the time. And I think that's just a vestige of capitalism. And I think that we need to be moving away from that altogether.
Yeah. I appreciate your thoughts. Calvin, I wanted to run something by you, and I just want you to give me your thoughts on this. Just on the move story, I want to mention as a seminal learning point for me in the discovery, in the narrative, in reality of the true corruption of our system. And I want to describe myself like the elements that crystallize for me there: the veneration of the racist piece of shit Frank Rizzo, the firefighters who don't put out the fire, the inferno that goes through the neighborhood, a statue put up for Frank, and one of the victims within Move, child victim, bones aren't even handled properly and end up in a college or university research area remains dehumanized, not given respect. There's aspects of the story when people are like, "Oh, is like the system really this? Is this all deliberate?" Um, it's so dehumanizing and so insulting, and part of me feels like there is a conscious intent of disregard for humans that is just beyond somebody being wrongfully arrested or being up. That is so much more severe about a complete degradation. And so for me, the impact of the full story, and there's other elements to this to move in another um, crimes against the people, that for me, sometimes when they're trying to explain, like, why do you think the system's all like all the way deep down corrupt? Because I said, because here's an example of where it is. It isn't an accident. And so there's a crystallization in the move situation for me. I just wondering if you had any comments or reflection on just the impact on me and how I've thought about it.
Absolutely. I think what you said is perfect in the sense that a lot of times people are shocked when they hear this story because it sounds like a Hollywood script, right? Like, so if you were to tell anyone that there is a group of people who are living, who a city then surrounds their house, gets into a kind of, not kind of, into a standoff with them, shoots bullets into that house, then drops a bomb on the house, then does not allow the fire, like all of these things to happen.
Yeah.
And then the bones discovery wasn't until, or at least it wasn't made public until I believe 2021 or 2022. This was not like, oh, well, they knew about it, right? And so think about how that just is degradation to the survivors of that bombing, to the members of the family, to the siblings, to everyone who did not know where their family members' bones were. They think that they've been incinerated, that they are gone, and not allowed to have a proper burial. And so this, what it really reminded me of too was, again, this is not unique to the United States either, but it reminded me of the story of the South African woman Sarah Baartman, who in the 18th century was a South African woman who was brought to France, was paraded around in some of kind of the earliest sideshow exhibitions, which would later become circuses. When she died, and she died very young, part of her body, part of her genitalia, a cast of her torso were put on display in museums in France and were on display up until the 1980s and then kept in storage up until the early 2000s because France wouldn't give them back to South Africa. And it wasn't until, I can't remember the exact year, your listeners can look it up, but until Nelson Mandela brokered the deal with France to receive this woman's, what remains had been left and put in storage in a French museum to be buried properly in South Africa. So it took this woman nearly 300 years to be returned to, the site at which she had been abducted.
Wow.
So I say all this to say that we hear, and I think this also gets back to a bit of the crux of defund and where I was trying to go with that book between reformists and abolitionists, is that oftentimes reformists will say the system is broken, the system needs to be fixed. But abolitionists are like, no, this is not broken. This is doing exactly what it intends to do.
Yeah.
Right. And yes, are there broken pieces of what and when what is intended to do happens? Sure. But more than not, a system that has hyper surveillance, overreach, targeting of particular segments of our society that follow very clearly distinctive racial, ethnic, religious, socioeconomic lines, that is not a broken system, right? That is a system that is actually, in a very warped way, a very efficient system. I mean, the United States has achieved something that really no one else has achieved in history with the amount of people that we have locked up, right, at one time. I mean, that is a true feat of depravity, but also, and again, a warped way, ingenuity, right? To figure out that how can we hold this many people at any given point and for this amount of time, it just highlights that it can't be broken. Broken would mean that it would be disorganized and, you know, some
Right.
places would be, but across the board, right? In all 50 states, we have, you know, mass incarceration, right? It's not like Florida is doing this and New York, we're living in a utopia. In fact, New York is one
Right.
of the last states, right? Just to kind of bring it back to some of the work I do. It wasn't until 2018 that New York passed what is known as raise the age. It was one of the last states that basically recognized that you probably shouldn't hold juveniles, people under the age of 18, in adult correctional facilities.
It's one of the last states. New York?
Yeah, it's one of the last ones. And at one point back in the 80s, when they had, you know, were doing all of the tough on crime stuff, at one point you could have been as young as 13 or 14 and been in an adult facility. Like, who's coming up with these things, right? I mean, like that is not a whoopsie. That is and the reason it's not a whoopsie is because this has to go through different channels. It has to be, someone has to conceive of it. It then has to become written in a formulaic way of a bill. It then gets debated on, you know, a House floor, gets voted upon, goes to the Senate floor, goes to that, and then it gets signed into legislation. So all of these things that created mass incarceration, that created a police state with hyper militarized vehicles and weaponry, these things didn't just happen overnight. They happened through, you know, systematic funding that was taken away from public social welfare programs and directed into criminal justice. And we see that, you know, as a pivotal point in the 1960s. Elizabeth Hinton talks a lot about this, that really some of the earliest shifts in policing happened under the Johnson administration, where he talks about police officers as frontline soldiers. And what were they responding to? They were responding to the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Right. When you look at policing during that time period, or just look at the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement wasn't protesting in opposition to the Klan. I mean, yes, the Klan was an argument of white supremacy, but when they were walking down the streets, it was the police stopping them, who also happened to be Klan members, but it was the police in their uniforms with their badges. It was Lori Pritchett in Albany, Georgia, who did mass arrests. He said, we're just going to arrest them and throw them in jails. We're not going to beat the hell out of them like
we'll figure out the math later, right?
Yeah. And he was praised for it, right? He was praised for his nonviolence, right? Whereas, you know, Bull Connor, you know, played into every, you know, psychotic wet dream of a person just going out and beating people. But, you know, this idea that police were going to ever be on someone's side is just nonsensical. That, you know, if we want a true society that you know, has public safety at the forefront, then we have to really think about labor. We have to think about universal access to things like education, healthcare, housing, leisure, recreation. I think all those are super, super important.
Yo, thank you for your comments, Calvin. I've there's sometimes as I'm a host, you know, like managing the show and stuff, and sometimes I just start listening and I drift off and like and thinking well, wait a second, I got something to do here. One little point over there at the Hunter College, there's a higher education collective bargaining research project comes out of there, and I made it to Hunter College. I think it was 2 years ago for the first time on campus. Was just astounded by the intelligence and the dedication of a lot of areas I'm just super interested in. There's a point of curiosity in talking to you. about teaching. What areas do you focus in and teach, or maybe ensuing research that you're continuing connected to your work?
Yeah. So yeah, to your point, I've actually I know a lot of those folks over there with the excuse me, the conference that happens at Hunter. I've actually participated as a as a moderator last year for one of the panels, which was really great because it was, I think, the first one back since COVID. So that was really amazing. And CUNY being New York City's public institution of higher learning, one of the things that we are also super proud of, I think, being at a place like CUNY is that, one, it is the university system that the majority of people who graduate New York City public high schools enter. We have one of the highest rates of first generation college students, first generation
Right.
Americans. It is a great place to work, and so I'll say
Awesome.
that. To answer your question about my work, so I'm teach a lot of courses around areas of race, social justice. So kind of the two classes that I teach pretty regularly. I teach a race and ethnicity course out of the sociology department. I teach another course called Law, Society, and Civil Rights, a course called Criminal Justice and Public Policy, where we really try to look at policy, particularly in real time. So the course usually changes a lot because we try to focus both locally and, so a few years ago, when I taught the course, a lot of it was thinking through about marijuana and legalization. We've talked a lot about the closing of Rikers. In fact, I think I even write about, I think Defund opens with a vignette from that particular course where the students and I in fall of 2021 had been very much watching and thinking about what was happening in the aftermath of summer 2020, and so yeah. And then to my research, I do a lot of research on incarceration, reentry, social movements. I have another book that should be coming out in spring of 2026 that I'm co-authoring with a colleague and friend of mine that is under contract with NYU Press, that looks at how folks who've been incarcerated and or still incarcerated utilize social media, particularly outlets like TikTok and Instagram, as a way to both memorialize, archive, and understand their lives through these kind of digital platforms. And more recently, I've been doing a lot of work around youth justice and restorative justice. And so I'm thinking through some projects that might move into those directions around what does, kind of a restorative justice pedagogy look like, particularly for young folks who are system impacted. So lots on the plate.
Thank you. Man, lot to think about. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and have this dialogue. I've learned so much, and I think it's almost like the conversations we have around organizing or people work. Our brains get moving. We're like, activated, and we can do something about this. So it's been absolutely great to talk with you. Calvin John Smiley, sometimes go by CJ. Calvin, tell folks where to go, get your book, look for your musings, etc.
Yeah.
Everywhere. Yeah.
So you can get my books. I've now got three. First is the co-edited volume that I did with Keisha and Middlemass, who is a associate professor down at Howard University. You can get that at Routledge. I have my book Purgatory Citizenship, which is out with University of California Press, and then there's Defund, which is with Haymarket. So I would encourage everyone to either go directly to your to the publisher's websites and or go to your local bookstores if you can. And then lastly, and again, I don't want to sound like a hypocrite. I use it too when it's convenient, all on Amazon as well. That's one thing I'll say real quick. I don't want to get rid of Amazon. I want to make it public. I want the workers to own it. I think that's what we need, right? I think that's sometimes one of the things when people say like get rid of Amazon. It's like, no, we don't need to get rid of it. We need to just make sure that the workers own it and get rid of Bezos, right? That's my position there.
Yeah, it's a very different frame of how to think about it, right? Because it's like the idea of if there are cost issues which are important to working people, or efficiency issues if we're doing it for ourselves rather than
and then I'll say I have a website that sorely needs updating, but it's cjsmiley.com, and you can also find me on Twitter at Uptown Castro with a K. And so those are all my plugs.
Love it. I want to let you know, CJ, I deeply appreciate your time and the engagement around this. I mean, for me, there are these kind of touchstones and coming in contact with this work in history and thinking about it going forward. I was very happy to see just a small excerpt. I think it might have been in These Times magazine. So how did these things happen? I get a magazine for free that as a union member I get for free. I see a quote for you in there, basic analysis. I see the fund. I'm reading about it and I'm like, holy shit, I remember, study and move for a long time ago because I'll never get over the shock and I'll continue to try to understand and see. And, but it was just such a rollicking thing that came from that, and have an opportunity to talk. These things are important to me and I wanted to express to you, it's an honor, to chat with you in this deep and important work and controversial, and of course media wise, defund died a couple of years ago, but you and I know that whatever that news cycle about the viability of anything can change quickly, and
absolutely.
There could be opportunity and resistance. So I wanted to deeply thank you for your time, intelligence, and your work.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. We might have the defund the police mayor of New York City, and then we'll see all that come out. And then to your point, you could also find some of my stuff in These Times magazine. Definitely support that magazine if you can. And then I guess I'll give a shout out to my organization, Till Everything Better. You can follow us on Instagram at Till Everything Better. So thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate you reaching out, and hope to be back at some point.
And for a better future. It's great chatting with you, Calvin, and thanks for everything you do.
Appreciate it.
Take care.
This is Something Rather Than Nothing.
And listeners, to stay connected with us and our guests, visit somethingratherthannothing.com. Join our mailing list for exclusive updates and access to guest-created art. If you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please like, subscribe, and leave a review on your podcast platform. People really read that shit. Your support helps us reach more listeners and spread our community across the planet. This is a global show, and we like to give a shout out to our many listeners across the world, including many listeners in Canada, Spain, Germany, UK, Argentina, Brazil, India, Thailand, and so many more places. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Something Rather Than Nothing Podcast for behind the scenes content. And the best way to help the show is to tell your friends about us. If you love it, they'll love it too. Tell your friends who love it. We love you. This is Something Rather Than Nothing Podcast.